When the world was young, it was desolate. There was a great plain of flinty, hard, joyless, infertile soil, from which, reaching up to the skies like 1,000 accusatory fingers, were great stone columns, menhirs, here, there, and everywhere, hundreds of them, thousands of them, clawing up, pointing towards the sky. And for a long time, that was all there was. The stones and the hardened, packed-in soil. But in time, there came rain. And the rain formed into rivulets, and into oceans, and into pools, and into lakes, and into mires. And it was from one of these mires that arose in the passage of time the great stag, Cernunnos himself. He stood and he emerged, the bracken waters pouring down his flanks, pouring down his great chest, pouring from his antlers. He stood and he shook and clambered from the dark and murky waters onto the land itself. And as he walked amongst these great stone columns, seeing nothing but himself and his reflection in the water and the stones and the hardened baked soil, he began to bellow, to bell, to sing in the language of the deer, which may not be tuneful to many ears, but to their own kind is as operatic music. And as he sang into existence each of the birds and the beasts that were to crawl and walk and fly and slither upon the earth. He called into existence the adders and the spiders and the ants and the badgers and the bears and the boars. He called into existence the horses and the bees and the butterflies. He called into existence the wrens and the larks and the thrushes. Bird after bird, beast after beast, insect after insect, fish after fish. He sang them all into existence, including, eventually, humanity itself. Perhaps the last of the things that he sang into existence. And as the last creature, humans, emerged into the world, they looked about themselves and they saw the stone columns, they saw the other creatures, they saw the great gigantic stag. They saw the waters and there was enough for them to drink, but nothing much for them to eat. The cows, the horses, the sheep, they had nothing to chew upon. None of the creatures had anything to eat, and they became hungrier and hungrier and hungrier. And the weather, which had been dry upon their first emergence into the world, began to become cooler and danker and wetter, and drizzle and rain began to fall and became heavier and heavier and colder and colder. And whilst the bear has a great shaggy pelt and the boar has a thick hide, the humans, of all the creatures in the world, it was the humans that had the least protection, the thinnest skin in so many ways. And they began to cry with the cold, just as the other animals, even if they were not particularly cold or particularly wet, began to cry with hunger. And the great stag heard their cries and thought of what must be done. And he walked amongst the great stone pillars of this plain of desolation until at length he came to the biggest, the hugest, the most enormous of all of the stone pillars. And there he began to rub his antlers against the stone pillars so that strips and strips of velvet fell down and puddled upon the earth. Until at length, after pushing and shoving and shoving and pushing his head against the great stone, there was a crack, and one of the antlers hung loose. And with a toss of his head, it ripped off and it spun through the air and thudded into the earth with such force that the base of the broken off antler lodged into the soil, the hard packed soil, and began in the instant to grow roots, just as the tines of the antler began to stretch upwards and put out shoots and became the very first hazel tree in the world. And at length the creatures of the world realised that now they had shelter from the sun and shelter from the rain. They could huddle underneath the branches of the hazel tree, and such was the speed of its growth and the vigour of its life that it began to put forth not only the leaves under which they could shelter, but in a short passage of time the nuts on which squirrel and a mouse and badger and boar could feed. And they were thankful and they gave praise to Stag at this. And still the stag was rubbing his other antler against the great stone pillar until that crack snapped, and with another toss of his head, that flew off through the air, spinning and turning until it thumped into the ground. And that too began to put forth roots and put forth shoots from the tines and grew into the first birch tree, with its great drooping string-like pendulous twigs coming down, giving shelter to all of the creatures that would gather underneath it, to the insects that would crawl upon its bark, and as the waters of the sap ran down sweet and rich, it gave sustenance and nurture to the creatures that would drink it. And those creatures in their turn gave thanks to the great stag. And within the hazel and within the birch there were spirits, not simply wood, inert wood, but living, thinking, breathing, sapient beings that some might call dryads or elves or fairies or spirits or whatever word you want to use to describe them. The spirit, the original birch and the original hazel, grandmother and grandfather, leapt from the trunks, and they danced around the plain of pillars, scattering seeds and scattering nuts and putting forth roots that would grow into other birch trees and nuts that would grow into other hazel trees. And soon there was not simply one hazel and one birch, but dozens of them sprouting up all over the great plain of pillars. But still there were those creatures who could not subsist upon hazelnuts or upon birch sap, who cried out that yes, they were now sheltered from the rain and the whipping of the wind, but they were still hungry, so very hungry. And Stag listened. The now antlerless Stag listened, and Cernunnos, father of the emergent forests, said to the beasts and the creatures of the world, "If you are hungry, eat of my flesh. Which of you will slay me so that the others may eat?" Boar refused, bear refused. Wild cat refused, creature after creature refused, eagle refused. None of them could bring themselves to slay the great stag. Till at length the only creature that would step forward to do it was humankind. Two of them, a man and a woman, stepped forward, and where Stag had rubbed his great antlers up against that enormous stone column, that pillar, bits of it had flaked off, and they picked up these bits and saw that they were as sharp could be. And they used them to slit the throat of Stag, to slit open his belly, ready to draw out the meat from within him. But before they could reach into him, and even as his life's blood was leaking into the soil and making it fertile, something began to emerge from the cavity of Stag's belly. Something sleek and furry and at first damp, but soon drying in the air. There emerged upon four paws the very first wolf. For as death came into the world, so wolf came into the world. And whilst there are many who will look to wolf as the killer of the forest, it is always worth remembering that it is humanity that is the true killer, not wolf. But the wild one threw back his head and howled and howled and howled to be alive and to be free upon the plain. And with the emergence of wolf, summer ended and winter began. The year turned. And whilst humans and bears and crows and eagles and the beasts of the forest fed upon the corpse of the mighty stag, and it was a very big corpse and fed them for a very long time, the wind around them began to grow cooler and colder and wilder as wolf prowled about the world, howling and howling. And where wolf walked, frost came in his wake, and icicles began to form upon the hazel trees and upon the birch trees, and of course with the cold they shed the leaves that they had not long put out, which began to form a blanket of comfort upon the earth for all of the things that crawl and wiggle and slither upon the soil. And even for the great hulking beasts, it gave them something more comfortable to lay upon than the rocky, flinty, barren soil that had been there beforehand. And with every day that turned to week, that turned to month, the world grew colder until the snows began to fall with the passage of wolf around the lands. And humans, of all of the creatures, most needed the skin, the hide of stag, to prepare it and cover it and wrap themselves in that hide as the first attempt at clothing. And when they looked to all those growing birch and hazel trees, that they saw the branches could be pulled down, cut down, and used to form bothies, used to form buildings, and parts of stag's skin could be put over as covering to provide them with warmth and shelter from the snows of winter. At length it was Owl that first noticed that Wolf was becoming very odd to look upon. Wolf's legs were growing longer and longer. His neck was getting longer and longer. There were appearing lumps upon Wolf's forehead, and his tail was retracting and shortening, and his fur was changing colour and itself shortening. And as they watched, and the rumour went round from one creature to another, as gossip will, they came out each in their turn on different days to watch Wolf, and each day he had got odder and odder in appearance, until at length, with the turning of the seasons from winter to summer, with a great shake, the last of Wolf's fur fell from him. Those silvery white locks were the last of the snow, and there, emergent with the buds upon his head, forming into antlers, Wolf became stag, not as a result of death, but as a result of life. And stag returned to the world. And over the summer months he walked and he observed his people. Some were thriving and some were suffering. And he listened to the tales of suffering until eventually, after many months of consideration, he went back to that great stone pillar. And again he scratched his head against it. He forced his antlers against it, shedding the velvet from them, until with a mighty crack one came off, and with a toss it went flying and landed in the earth, and rooted and became the first oak tree. And with a mighty crack the other one flew and rooted and became the first hawthorn tree. And these grew, and they provided shelter for many animals. They provided acorns, and they provided haw-berries for birds, and for the wild boar to eat, and for all manner of other creatures to consume. And as the oak tree grew and grew at vast speed, it provided so much shelter for so many creatures. And as hawthorn grew thicker and thicker, it provided hedges and windbreaks for the whipping of the wind and the blizzards that were yet to come, for creatures, particularly birds, to shelter in. And just as grandmother birch and grandfather hazel leapt and danced about the world, sowing their progeny, their seeds, so grandfather oak and grandmother hawthorn leapt and danced about the world, sowing a multitude of oaks and a multitude of thorns about the world. And the forest grew bigger and bigger, and animals that had previously been famished and half starved were now filling up. But again it was humanity that cried that they needed more skins, more meat. And Stag once again said, as he had said the previous year, "Take your blade from the great stone, slit my throat, slit open my belly, let the process begin again. And it did. And year upon year it continued, with the putting out of the great antlers to create holly trees and willow trees, to create gorse bushes, to create all manner of plants and trees and populate the forests. And as the leaves of the trees fell, so the smaller plants and the smaller shrubs grew up from the fertile soil, made fertile by falling leaves and by the shedding of Cernunnos' blood into the soil. Each summer the stag walked the earth, each winter the wolf walked the earth. And over the passage of who knows how many generations, the mighty stone against which Cernunnos rubbed his antlers each year was gradually worn and worn and worn away until it became a small boulder. And by this time, stag had had many progeny. There were many other smaller stags and does wandering the earth. And when those smaller stags came to that time of year, came to the shedding of the year, they would rub their antlers against the great stone and shed them, and against the other stones and shed them, until each of the stones upon the great plain of pillars was worn down and worn down, which is why these days there are so few standing stones left in the world, because the deer have worn them away to nothing. But such is the passage of life, and the growth of the forest has spread far and has spread wide, and the creatures have been fed full and fat upon the produce of the forest, and the plants have grown rich and luxuriant upon the fall of leaves and the shedding of blood. And it is perhaps the case that Cernunnos no longer sheds his horns to create trees, for all trees have been created. What becomes of his antlers, well, who can say? But each season, deer turns to wolf, and then wolf in time turns back to deer. The tide goes on, and we benefit from the sacrifice of the ancient one.